This is the beautiful Piazza of Santissima Annunziata, just to the north of Florence's famous Duomo. And I think in its very harmonious architecture, it really is one of the most serene piazzas in Florence. Well, I'm standing next to a great equestrian bronze statue of Ferdinando I dei Medici, who's looking proudly down towards the Duomo there. But what I really want to focus on today is the building just behind Ferdinando. And dodging the bikes and the taxis here. This is the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Foundling Hospital that was designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, the same architect who more famously did the dome of the Duomo in Florence. And it's a particularly groundbreaking piece of architecture, this building, because it really was the first building that consciously and systematically uses classical architectural motifs in its vocabulary. So you can see it has a sense of the horizontal, whereas earlier buildings in Florence really were built on a vertical plane. Medieval Florence was like a medieval Manhattan, essentially, with great stone medieval skyscrapers, whereas Brunelleschi here completely transforms that sort of verticality by working on the horizontal plane. Obviously, you can see that the loggia of the Innocenti uses Roman-style rounded arches on columns that are graced with Corinthian-style capitals. And then between the arches, you can see these roundels with infants depicted in relief. Of course, those infants in swaddling bands reflect the fact that this was a hospital, really, an orphanage, in effect, that would take in abandoned or orphaned infants, babies, essentially. Brunelleschi built it in the 1420s, and it continued to be used as a foundling hospital until 1875, so it has a very long history. And there's a museum in it today of works that were commissioned for the Foundling Hospital. It also contains little mementos that the mother who was leaving their child here would leave little tokens, sometimes a heart-shaped token or a little bracelet, something like that, that would be cut in half. And the mother would retain one half and leave the other half in the Foundling Hospital in the hope that they might meet again one day. And the museum to this day still has all these many tokens that were collected over the years. The roundels, though, going back to the roundels, they were inspired by ancient Roman reliefs. So again, this is another example of the revival of classical architecture that we see on the Innocenti. And they're done in glazed terracotta. And that was a new technique, glazing terracotta with a vitreous enamel glaze. It was a new technique invented by Luca della Robbia. And the idea was that the white glaze would look like marble. It was a sort of poor man's marble. Well, one of the things that gives this building such a sense of harmony is the symmetry that Brunelleschi uses everywhere. For instance, the width between the bays here is exactly the same as the depth of the loggia here. And he also uses these geometric forms. So essentially, if you take your eye up to the top of the column where the Corinthian capital is there, and draw a sort of an imaginary line across it, you have a perfect square. And then above that square, of course, you have an implied circle. The semicircular dome, of course, implies a circular shape. So you have these symbolic shapes, the circle representing eternal life in paradise, the square representing mortal life on earth. So it's rather beautiful the way that Brunelleschi brings together these symbolic forms. And in its sum of the parts, essentially, this loggia of the Innocenti was absolutely foundational work in the history of Renaissance architecture. The window that you can see here marks the place where, for many centuries, mothers would come and leave their infant children. Often they were newborn children, usually the children of illicit relationships. Occasionally they were orphan children, but for the most part they were actually abandoned children. And the infants would be placed here on a cushioned rotating wheel, and the wheel would turn and the infant would be taken in by the nuns of the Innocenti, who would then give them care, board and lodging. Often boys would be adopted because the boys were useful for manual labour and agricultural work and so on. Many girls would subsequently go into convents unless they could be married. So this little window has a long history really of taking in infants. Indeed, it continued to function until 1875. On the north side of Piazza Santissima Annunziata, you can see the building with a beautiful, graceful portico there. That portico actually was inspired by Brunelleschi's portico, the loggia of the Innocenti that I was talking about earlier. And here, the portico actually graces the front of the church of Santissima Annunziata. That is a particularly historic church, actually. It goes right back to the mid-13th century. It was founded by the order of monks known as the Servites. And at the time, this was out of the city of Florence. It was virtually in the countryside. Of course, the city later grew up all around it. Hence, we have this decidedly urban space today. But certainly when the Servites founded the church, it was in a rather remote piece of land on the edge of the city. And its story really revolves around a miraculous image. So we can go inside and explore that story. Well, the miraculous image of the Virgin Annunciate proved to be such an extraordinary pilgrim destination that people came in their thousands, millions over the decades and centuries, giving wax votive offerings to the Virgin. And those votive offerings were often life-size wax models of the donor, complete with horses as well. And the votive offerings became so numerous that this entire atrium that you can see behind me had to be built on to the front of the church in order to house them all. The building work was started in the mid-15th century by the architect Michelozzi, and subsequently in the 16th century it was then frescoed all round by some very, very important Florentine artists. Now, one of the earliest frescoes in the atrium is actually one over just here to my right. This is by a painter called Alessio Baldovinetti, and it shows the Nativity of Christ. You can see the ox and the ass. Poor Mary has much deteriorated with time, but to the left of Mary, you can see a beautiful landscape, an absolutely Tuscan landscape, probably the valley beyond Florence there. Whereas this wall stretching round behind me and round this side of the atrium was frescoed in the second decade of the 16th century by some of the most extraordinary artists working in Florence in this period. Notably, the one behind me here is by Andrea del Sarto, a wonderful artist indeed. He was known in his own day as a painter who could paint senza errori, without errors, the flawless painter he's subsequently become known as. This scene, it begins the story of the life of the Virgin Mary. Of course, the church is dedicated to the Virgin Annunciate. Here we actually see the nativity of the Virgin Mary. So the little baby girl that you can see being warmed by the fireplace in the corner is Mary. You can also see in that fireplace an older child is warming herself. It's a lovely sort of snapshot of Renaissance life, because apparently the Nativity of the Virgin is taking place in a Florentine Renaissance palazzo. But also on that fireplace, you can see the date just written on the plinth above the girl's head, 1514. Above that, on the top of the fireplace, Andrea del Sarto has written his name. So we have a signed and dated fireplace there. Other beautiful things to look out for here. You have a snapshot of a Florentine Renaissance bedroom, in effect, complete with a splendid bed with a canopy. And you see a typical birth scene here, actually, with primarily women milling around this magnificent bed on a wooden platform. You can see women bringing Mary's mother Anne food on round trays. This is actually a reference to an earlier Florentine tradition called the birth tray. They were painted round trays that after the birth of a child would be hung on a wall as a decorative object, and hence a long tradition of round paintings celebrating births. A little further on down the same wall in the Chiostro dei Voti, we can see three more frescoes by three other of the great early 16th century artists in Florence. And in fact, this place really has been called the School of Santissima Annunziata, because you have this group of really important painters who begin to define the so-called Mannerist style in the early 16th century. All followers of Michelangelo. And in the next three works, you'll absolutely see the influence of Michelangelo. Let's start perhaps with this one here, which continues the narrative of the life of the Virgin. We see here, in the middle of the scene, the betrothal of the Virgin. And you can see Joseph to the left there, Mary to the right, holding out her hand for the ring, of course. Sadly, Mary's face is badly destroyed. Now, according to the writer and architect and painter Giorgio Vasari, this was because the artist who did this fresco, Franciabigio, was working here together with his close associate Andrea del Sarto, and the two of them, of course, became rivals. And one morning, the friars of Santissima Annunziata decided that they were going to unveil the frescoes here, with Andrea del Sarto's down there and Franciabigio's here. But Franciabigio hadn't yet finished his, and he was so enraged that he had his unfinished work exposed, and therefore it made him look like the lesser artist. He was so enraged by this that, according to Vasari, he took a hammer to the Virgin's face and attacked it, destroying it, and that is why it's in this damaged state to this day. Coming round here, really most beautiful fresco, I think. This is by Jacopo Pontormo. And here you can see, I think, two influences. You see the influence of Michelangelo in those vibrant rather acidic colours. This scene shows the visitation when Mary and Elizabeth meet, both of them expecting their respective children, Jesus and John, of course. So the influence of Michelangelo, certainly, but also of Raphael. The composition with the figures seated on the steps is very much inspired by Raphael's school of Athens in Rome. It's a beautiful, voluptuous, sinuous work. Look at all the curves of the figures and the exquisite drapery, and the fact that people are looking in various directions, looking out at us, turning towards us, really inviting us in to the scene, I think. Only Mary and Elizabeth in the centre of the scene are actually looking at each other. Then just down to the right, you can see gesticulating, you can see Joseph kneeling, he's the figure kneeling. And then just a little further to the right, you can see Zachariah, of course, John's father. So we have Joseph and Zachariah in this beautiful scene by Pontormo. And then over here, further on, to close this wall, we have the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. This is done by Rosso Fiorentino, another important early 16th century artist, again one of the followers of Michelangelo, who has a very distinctive style. You can see how he's been influenced by Andrea del Sarto, notably in those lovely shades of violet. Look at the clouds in the sky around the Virgin. Beneath her, the apostles looking up to the Virgin assumed into heaven there. Particularly lovely detail, if you look at the figure in the centre, in the green cloak, you see how Rosso Fiorentino has let the cloak, as it were, fall out of the fresco, a nice sort of illusionary effect that brings him almost into our space. So the Chiostro dei Voti, really an extraordinary display of Mannerist painting in Florence. As you can see, this is a really splendid Baroque church, rather unusual in Florence actually. There isn't so much Baroque architecture, and certainly not of this sort of splendour and lavishness. And indeed, the whole church was given this elaborate Baroque makeover in order to show how important it was because of a miraculous sacred image. In this case, it's the image of the Virgin Annunciate, and hence the church is called Santissima Annunziata, the Holy Annunciate. And the image, it's said, was painted in the mid-13th century by a friar of the original church here called Friar Bartolomeo. And Friar Bartolomeo, apparently, when he came to paint the face of the Virgin, thought he could not begin to capture her divine beauty. And so he paused and he slept. And while he slept, an angel came and painted the face of the Virgin Mary. And so when he awoke, he saw that it had been miraculously finished. And so it is one of these so-called miraculous images, the acheropoeta in Greek. They're known as images made without human hands. And as you can imagine, it developed an extraordinary cult following of pilgrims and devout worshippers who came to the church. And as I say, the church was then aggrandized and given this very lavish makeover, including splendid Baroque organs that you can see here on both sides, in fact. So you could have antiphonal effect music. And still to this day, this church is a very important place of worship, very much part of the local devotional life in Florence. Mass has just finished here, and the image of the Virgin Annunciate has been closed up it reflects medieval rituals in a sense, when images were regularly either closed with doors or veils would be dropped down over them, and then either those doors or those veils would be opened and lifted up for important moments in the liturgy. So it's rather nice to see this tradition continuing here. And so as we leave the atrium, the Chiostro dei Voti, and the Church of Santissima Annunziata, we come back into the piazza and we're rewarded with a wonderful view of Brunelleschi's dome in the distance there.